The morning rush had just begun at Rosie's Diner, a small roadside cafe where the scent of pancakes, bacon, and hot coffee filled the air. The chatter of customers mixed with the clinking of plates, creating a familiar rhythm that Maya, a young black waitress, had come to love. She moved between tables with her usual grace, balancing trays and flashing the warm smile that made everyone feel at home. But as she turned toward the back corner of the diner, something caught her eye, a lone elderly woman sitting quietly by the window. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she wore a faded blue coat that looked far too thin for the cold morning. Unlike the other customers, who were laughing and talking, this woman sat still, her gaze lost in the steam rising from her untouched cup of coffee. Something about her calmness amid the chaos drew Maya's attention. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over with her usual cheerful energy. "Good morning, ma'am. What can I get you today?" she asked with a smile. But there was no response. The woman didn't even blink. Thinking perhaps the noise of the diner had drowned her out, Maya leaned closer and spoke louder, her tone still gentle. "Ma'am, are you ready to order?" Still nothing. That's when Maya noticed it, a small, barely visible hearing aid tucked behind the woman's ear. The realization hit her softly. The woman wasn't ignoring her. She couldn't hear her. For a moment, Maya stood frozen. She looked around and saw her co-workers exchanging glances, whispering. She overheard one of them murmur, "That's the deaf lady from last week. She never understands what anyone's saying. It's a waste of time." The words made Maya's chest tighten. She turned back, toward the woman, who was now glancing at her with eyes that seemed both kind and apologetic. Instead of walking away, Maya smiled wider. She grabbed a small notepad from her pocket, quickly scribbled down a message, and slid it gently across the table. "Good morning, ma'am. What would you like today?" The woman blinked, startled. Slowly, she reached for the note, her thin fingers trembling slightly as she read the words. Then, she looked up at Maya, and something in her expression softened. A faint, grateful smile appeared on her face, as if someone had just switched on a forgotten light inside her. She picked up the pen Maya had left on the table and wrote back, her handwriting delicate but clear. "Thank you, dear. I would like tea and toast, please." Maya's heart lifted. She nodded, holding the note to her chest like a small treasure, and hurried off to place the order. The other waitresses watched in surprise. "You actually wrote to her?" one asked. "Of course," Maya replied simply. "Everyone deserves to be spoken to, one way or another." When she returned with the tea and toast, she didn't just drop it off and leave. She took a moment to make sure everything was just right, pouring the tea carefully and setting the cup within easy reach. The woman smiled again and mouthed a silent thank you. Maya smiled back and tapped the table twice, a small gesture to let her know she understood. The woman's eyes shimmered with emotion, and she wrote another quick message. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Maya read the words, curiosity blooming in her chest. She wanted to ask more, but the diner had grown busier, and she was needed elsewhere. Still, as she walked away, she kept glancing back at the corner booth. The woman was sipping her tea slowly, her expression peaceful but distant, as if she were lost in an old memory. Something about her presence felt important, though Maya couldn't explain why. It was as if this quiet customer carried a story that hadn't been told in years, a story waiting for someone patient enough to listen. As the day went on and the lunch crowd replaced the breakfast rush, Maya found herself thinking about the woman's eyes, about the way they had brightened the moment she realized someone was willing to communicate with her. Most people saw a deaf old lady, a customer who took too much time. But Maya saw something else, a person longing to be understood, to be seen. When the woman finally stood to leave, she tucked a few bills under her plate and folded a napkin beside them. Maya came to clear the table and noticed the napkin was heavier than it should be. She opened it carefully and found a short message written in neat, fragile handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me. not just serving me. The words stopped her cold. She looked toward the window, hoping to catch one last glimpse of the woman. But she was already gone, walking slowly down the street, with her coat flapping in the wind. Maya stood there for a long moment, the napkin pressed to her heart, feeling something shift inside her, a quiet sense that this encounter, however small, meant more than she yet understood. She didn't know it then, but this simple act of kindness would open a door to something far bigger than either of them could imagine. The next morning, the diner was filled once again with the sound of clinking dishes, the soft hum of conversation, and the smell of sizzling bacon. Maya, now back on her usual shift, found her thoughts drifting toward the elderly woman from the day before. There had been something about her, something quiet but powerful that lingered in Maya's mind long after she'd left. As the morning crowd thinned, Maya looked up from the counter and froze. There she was again, sitting in the same corner booth by the window, her pale blue coat folded neatly beside her. The sunlight fell across her silver hair, making it glisten like a halo. Maya felt a smile tug at her lips as she grabbed her notepad and walked over. She didn't speak. Instead, she wrote a simple note, "Welcome back, ma'am. It's good to see you again." When she slid it across the table, the woman's face lit up with recognition. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she wrote back, "Good to see you too, dear. My name is Eleanor." Maya read the name and nodded warmly, placing her hand over her heart in a silent greeting. From that moment on, their conversation began, not through sound, but through words written on paper, through glances, gestures, and smiles. Maya took Eleanor's order carefully, making sure to write each question down, waiting patiently as the older woman responded. It took time, but Maya didn't mind. There was something comforting about the slow rhythm of their exchange. When the food arrived, a simple plate of eggs, toast, and fruit, Maya noticed Eleanor's eyes soften as she watched her work. After a while, Eleanor picked up the pen again and wrote a short message. "You remind me of someone I loved very much." Maya's breath caught. She looked at Eleanor, curious, but the older woman only smiled a deep, nostalgic smile that seemed to hold years of memories. Maya didn't ask who that person was. Instead, she smiled back and placed her hand gently on Eleanor's shoulder before walking away to serve another table. Yet, even as she moved through her duties, her heart felt heavier, not with sadness, but with a strange warmth she couldn't explain. Throughout the meal, Maya made sure Eleanor was never forgotten. She refilled her coffee without being asked, lightly tapping the edge of the table each time so the woman would know she was there. The simple gesture made Eleanor beam, her eyes shining behind her thin glasses. Customers began to notice the quiet dance between the two, a waitress and a customer who spoke not with voices, but with understanding. The usual noise of the diner softened as people looked on, feeling something gentle ripple through the room. A few regulars whispered to each other, smiling at the sight. It wasn't often that silence could fill a place with so much warmth. Eleanor lingered after finishing her meal, sipping her coffee and writing small notes on the napkin beside her. Thoughts, bits of memory, perhaps words she wished someone could hear. Maya wanted to ask about her life, her family, the person she had once loved, but something told her to let the moment breathe on its own. There was peace in the silence, as if breaking it would disturb something fragile and sacred. When it was finally time to leave, Eleanor reached for her purse, then paused. She folded a napkin in half with great care and slipped something inside before placing it near the edge of the table. Maya came by to clear the dishes and noticed the folded napkin sitting neatly beside the empty plate. She looked up, but Eleanor was already standing by the door, smiling softly as she waved goodbye. Maya smiled back, her heart suddenly heavy with the thought that she might not see her again. When the door closed, Maya wiped the table and picked up the napkin. She expected it to be a simple thank you note, but when she unfolded it, her hands stilled. Inside, written in shaky but graceful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for seeing me, not just serving me." Maya read the line again and again, her throat tightening. The diner around her seemed to fade into silence. She sat down at the booth, the napkin trembling in her hands. It was such a simple message, yet it carried more weight than any words she'd ever heard. She realized then that Eleanor wasn't just thanking her for breakfast, she was thanking her for kindness, for presence, for acknowledgement in a world that often overlooked the quiet and the old. Maya pressed the napkin against her heart, blinking back tears. Something deep inside her told her this was only the beginning, that this gentle encounter, born in silence, would lead to something far greater than she could yet imagine. 2 days had passed since Maya last saw Eleanor, yet the memory of their silent conversation still lingered in her heart. The diner had returned to its usual routine, the chatter of regulars, the sound of clinking cups, and the smell of coffee brewing in the air. But Maya found herself glancing every so often toward the corner booth by the window, half expecting to see that familiar blue coat and gentle smile. On the third morning, as sunlight poured through the glass, she froze mid-step. The booth was occupied again. Her heart leaped, but then she noticed something different. Eleanor wasn't alone this time. Sitting beside her was a man in his 40s, neatly dressed in a gray suit, with the same calm eyes and kind features as the older woman. His posture was tense, his fingers tapping nervously on the table as he looked around the diner. He didn't seem like someone used to such a simple, cozy place. Maya hesitated for a moment before approaching, her notepad in hand and her heart beating a little faster. Before she could write her usual greeting, Eleanor looked up, recognized her instantly, and waved with a warm smile. The gesture alone made Maya's own face light up. She waved back, her eyes soft with joy. The man looked between the two women, puzzled. "So you're the waitress she's been talking about," he said finally, his voice carrying both curiosity and relief. Maya blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. "She's been talking about me?" she asked softly. The man nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Yes. My grandmother doesn't usually go out much these days. She hasn't spoken much since my grandfather passed away." His tone dropped low at the end, and he looked away, his expression tightening, as if the memory still hurt. "She told me that coming here made her feel heard, even when she can't hear herself anymore." The words hit Maya like a wave, filling her chest with a warmth she couldn't explain. She turned to Eleanor, who was watching them both with a knowing smile. Her eyes sparkled with emotion, and before Maya could think of what to write, the elderly woman reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it gently over Maya's. The simple touch said more than any words could. The air around them seemed to still. The soft noise of the diner faded as the three of them sat in quiet understanding, a moment of connection that transcended words or explanations. Maya felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something comforting, something that could express the strange mix of gratitude and tenderness swelling inside her, but nothing came out. She only nodded, her eyes glistening as she squeezed Eleanor's frail hand in return. The man, who had been watching silently, exhaled slowly, as if something heavy in his chest had begun to lift. "I wanted to see this place," he said quietly, "the one she kept writing about in her notes." Maya tilted her head, surprised again. Her notes. The man smiled faintly and reached into his jacket, pulling out a small folded paper. "She writes everything down, thoughts, names, little things she doesn't want to forget. A few days ago, she wrote about a waitress who listens without words. She said you made her feel human again." Maya's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and smiled at Eleanor, who gave her hand a gentle pat. The woman's smile was full of pride, the kind that said thank you for understanding what others didn't. The man introduced himself as David, and as they spoke, Maya noticed how protective he was of his grandmother. how his entire demeanor softened when he looked at her. The walls he carried as a businessman seemed to melt away in her presence. Eleanor scribbled something on her notepad and slid it toward Maya. The words were shaky but clear. "He works too hard. I wanted him to see what kindness looks like." Maya chuckled softly, glancing at David, who was now helping Eleanor cut her toast. "I can see where he gets his strength from," Maya said warmly. Eleanor smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. For the rest of the morning, Maya served them quietly, moving with her usual care, making sure Eleanor always had a warm cup of tea, and David never ran out of coffee. Occasionally, the man would look around the diner and shake his head in wonder, as if realizing how a place so small could hold so much heart. By the time they were ready to leave, the tension on his face had vanished, replaced by a kind of calm that mirrored his grandmother's. As he helped Eleanor to her feet, he turned to Maya and said softly, "Thank you for being there for her. You did more than you know." Maya felt her throat tighten again, but managed to smile. "She did the same for me," she replied quietly. Eleanor pressed Maya's hand one last time before they left, her eyes full of unspoken gratitude. As they walked out together, Maya stood by the window, watching them cross the street slowly. Something deep inside her told her that this meeting was not by chance, that fate had quietly stitched their lives together for a reason. She was only beginning to understand, as Maya carefully set down the plates of food in front of Eleanor and her grandson. She could sense that something had shifted in the air. The tension that had shadowed the man's face earlier was slowly melting away. He loosened his tie, glanced around the diner, and then at Maya, his expression softening. "I never come to places like this," he said after a moment, almost as if confessing. "I spend most of my days in offices, meetings, deadlines, reports. I didn't even know small diners like this still existed." Maya smiled politely, but she could tell there was more behind his words. As she poured him another cup of coffee, he continued, "My name's David. I run a company in the city, finance, mostly. It's been my whole life for years." He gave a quiet, self-conscious laugh, as if realizing how empty that sounded. Then he glanced at his grandmother, who was stirring her tea slowly, her eyes distant but peaceful. His voice softened. "After my grandfather passed away, she stopped smiling. She stopped cooking, stopped going out. She just shut down. We tried everything, therapists, clubs, new hobbies, but nothing worked. She didn't even want to talk anymore." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then, one day, she told me she wanted to come here. She said there was a waitress who didn't just serve her food, she made her feel seen." Maya froze for a second, her eyes flickering to Eleanor. The elderly woman was looking at her with that same gentle smile, the one that carried more gratitude than words could hold. Maya's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, so she simply reached for her notepad and wrote a small message before sliding it toward Eleanor. "I'm glad you came back. You make this place brighter." Eleanor read the note and smiled even wider, her eyes shimmering. Then, with trembling hands, she picked up her pen and began to write something herself. David and Maya waited quietly as she took her time, every letter slow and deliberate. When she finally slid the paper across the table, Maya read it softly to herself. "You showed me kindness that money can't buy. You reminded me of who I used to be." The words hit Maya like a wave. Her chest grew tight, her eyes stung, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze, and saw tears shining in the old woman's eyes too. It was as if two souls had recognized something familiar in each other, the same loneliness, the same longing to be understood. David, watching the exchange, fell silent. For the first time that day, his expression changed from polite curiosity to deep reflection. He looked around the diner again at the cracked vinyl seats, the flickering light above the counter, the faded menus, and then back at Maya, who was wiping her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be seen crying. "You have no idea what you've done," he said softly. "You brought her back to us. You made her feel alive again." His voice broke slightly, and the entire diner seemed to grow quieter. Even the clinking of dishes and the chatter of other customers faded into the background. Maya shook her head gently. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just listened." But David smiled sadly. "That's the part people forget how to do." A few moments passed in comfortable silence. Then David stood up, straightened his jacket, and cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said to the other waitresses and the small handful of customers who had turned to watch. His voice carried a calm authority, but there was warmth in it now, not the tone of a businessman giving orders, but of a grandson speaking from his heart. "I'd like to do something special for this place," he announced, his eyes meeting Maya's, "in honor of my grandmother's new friend." The staff froze, unsure if they had heard correctly. Maya blinked in surprise. "Oh, sir, that's not necessary," she began, but he held up a hand. "It is," he said simply. "This diner gave something to my grandmother that I couldn't buy. Peace, joy, connection. I want to give something back." The room filled with murmurs of surprise. Eleanor smiled proudly, squeezing her grandson's hand as tears formed at the corners of her eyes. She reached for her notepad again and wrote one more sentence before handing it to Maya. The note read, "Some people fix hearts without even knowing they were broken." Maya's lips trembled as she read the words. Her eyes moved from the paper to Eleanor's face, then to David's, and in that instant, she realized how powerful a single act of kindness could be. She had thought she was just doing her job, but in reality, she had mended something fragile, something that no amount of wealth or success could touch. As she stood there, surrounded by quiet awe, Maya felt a deep sense of purpose bloom inside her. Whatever David was planning, she knew it wasn't about money or grand gestures. It was about honoring the simple truth that kindness, given freely, can change a life, sometimes even two. A week had passed since that emotional morning when David had promised to do something special for the diner, and though Maya tried not to think much of it, she couldn't shake the curiosity that lingered in her heart. Rosie's diner had been temporarily closed, the blinds drawn and the doors locked for maintenance, but nobody knew exactly what was going on inside. The mystery filled the small town with whispers and excitement. Maya was told to arrive on Saturday morning, dressed in her uniform but with no shift scheduled. When she pulled up to the diner, the early light of dawn cast a golden glow over the windows, and her heart began to race. The parking lot was full of cars, more than she had ever seen there before. She stepped out cautiously, smoothing her apron, and pushed the door open, and immediately froze in awe. The familiar smell of coffee and fried bacon was still there, but everything looked different. The dull lights had been replaced by soft golden fixtures that made the space glow like morning sunshine. The red booths were newly polished, the floor gleamed, and fresh flowers sat on every table. The cracked sign above the counter had been replaced with a shining new one that read, "Rosie's Diner, a place where every voice is heard." Near the entrance, a small bronze plaque caught her eye. She stepped closer, and as her eyes scanned the engraved words, she gasped. It read, "In memory of love that listens, dedicated to Maya and Eleanor." Her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt unreal, like walking into a dream she didn't know she'd been wishing for. Behind her, someone called softly, "Do you like it?" Maya turned, and there stood David, dressed casually this time, his tie gone, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You did this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled. "Not just me," he said, stepping aside. There, sitting at her usual corner booth, was Eleanor. She was wearing a light blue dress, and her hair was pinned neatly, her eyes shining with pride. She waved to Maya with a trembling hand, her face glowing with joy. Maya covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She hurried over, her shoes clicking against the floor, and Eleanor reached out to take her hand. She pressed something into Maya's palm, a small folded piece of paper. Maya unfolded it slowly, her heart pounding as she read the handwritten words. "You didn't just hear me, child. You healed me." The simple message broke something open inside her. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt beside the old woman, their hands locked tightly together. Around them, the crowd had fallen silent, watching as two souls from different worlds shared a moment beyond words. David stepped forward and spoke quietly to the onlookers. "My grandmother's life changed here," he said. This place reminded her that kindness still exists, that compassion doesn't need to be heard to be felt. In her honor, and in gratitude to Maya, we've started a community fund to help seniors with hearing disabilities find connection, care, and comfort. A quiet murmur swept through the diner, followed by gentle applause. Maya, still holding Eleanor's note, looked up at David, overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, her voice trembling. He smiled warmly. "Maybe not, but sometimes the best things we do are the ones we don't have to." As the day went on, the diner filled with laughter and life. The air felt lighter, brighter, as if the place itself had been reborn. People from town came to see the transformation, to hear the story of the deaf grandmother and the kind waitress whose friendship had inspired something beautiful. Reporters showed up later that week, and soon, word spread beyond the small town. People began visiting from neighboring cities, not just for the food, but for the feeling. They came to sit where Eleanor once sat, to take pictures beside the plaque, to leave small notes of their own, stories of kindness, gratitude, and hope. Maya found herself reading those notes every morning before opening the diner, smiling through tears as she realized how far one simple act of understanding could reach. Eleanor continued to visit often, always sitting at the same booth by the window, always waving as Maya brought her tea. Sometimes, they didn't write at all, they would just sit, sharing smiles in silence, their hearts speaking a language deeper than words. And though life moved on and the seasons changed, the bond between them remained as steady as ever. People began calling Rosie's Diner the Diner of Hearts, a place where kindness was served with every cup of coffee. On quiet evenings, when the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Maya would glance at the plaque near the door and whisper softly, "Thank you, Eleanor." And somewhere in the stillness of the night, she always felt an answer, not in sound, but in peace, because some stories don't need to be spoken aloud to be heard, and some love doesn't need words to be remembered forever.